You're listening to On Shifting Ground. I'm Ray Suarez. In a world still awash in nukes, we can't forget the threat of nuclear engagement as President Biden makes the case for U.S. support in Israel and Ukraine. Israel is likely to have a nuclear arsenal, though it's never been officially acknowledged. Ukraine surrendered its nukes in return for a guarantee of its territorial integrity back in the 1990s. In 2023, how serious is the threat of nuclear war? To help me answer this and other questions, we turn to Mallory Stewart, the Assistant Secretary for the Bureau of Arms Control, Verification, and Compliance at the U.S. Department of State. Assistant Secretary, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me here. I'm really happy to speak with you today.
One of the more shocking, I guess it's fair to say, tropes that Russia has used over the last 20 months or so in its conflict with Ukraine is the threat, the willingness to speculate openly about nuclear weapons and their use in the Ukraine war. What does Russia's recent revocation of nuclear testing limits say about Putin's state of mind and Russia's posture?
Yeah, absolutely. We've seen Russia both provide thinly veiled escalatory statements, thinly veiled nuclear threats throughout this conflict. And I think it's deeply unfortunate that Russia feels it's in their interest to further destabilize the international security environment by making these threats and raising the specter of nuclear escalation. With respect to Russia's movement on the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, we're trying to figure out what it actually means for their requirements under the treaty. Do they still have signatory obligations not to violate the object and purpose of the treaty? Are they still planning on abiding in some way with their moratorium on nuclear testing? And that's what we need to understand. But unfortunately, Russia lately has seen it in their interest to destabilize the arms control and nonproliferation environment by raising the specter of nuclear escalation and by walking away from their international legal commitments, including the New START treaty. And I think what we have to do is remind Russia that nuclear war and nuclear escalation is in no one's interest, nor is raising nuclear risks and the risks of misunderstanding, miscalculation, and unintentional escalation. And we all have to work together to make sure that Russia appreciates our efforts toward risk reduction are in their interest just as much as they're in the world's interest.
Sometimes these speculations, these references to nuclear weapons, come from official sources, from President Putin himself, from former president and very close Putin ally, former President Medvedev. But sometimes it's in the context of a television talk show where the discussants are known to be very well wired in the Kremlin. Is there close attention paid to unofficial, in addition to official sources, on this kind of intel?
We're trying to follow all of the commentary on this, especially those comments that come from those that are close to the leadership in the Russian government. But certainly, as we are trying to understand and hear the positions that the Russian government or proxies are taking on this, we're trying to focus our efforts on ensuring that Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine is not successful. And we have to make sure that they do not divide our close partners and our alliance unity to prevent this war from being successful. Because, again, violating the UN Charter and Ukrainian sovereignty is illegal in many ways, but also extraordinarily destabilizing. So, as our National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, has said, rather than waiting to resolve all of these very serious bilateral differences, including, of course, disregard by Russia of the UN Charter, the United States is ready to engage with Russia to manage nuclear risks and develop a post-2026 arms control framework, again, when our New START agreement would have expired if Russia had not illegally suspended it. We are prepared to enter into those discussions, and we must be able to communicate that to Russia, even while they're further destabilizing that international architecture through many different voices.
One of the most prominent motifs of the late Cold War was mutual compliance and mutual verification. There was this idea that if you do something, we'll do something, and vice versa. When Russia backed away from its commitments on tests. How did the United States respond? Did we begin tests again?
No, absolutely not. In response to both Russians' violations of the New START treaty, we saw a completely lawful countermeasures approach as the best way. So, in the New START context, we took proportionate and reversible countermeasures, which are allowable and appropriate under international law, to persuade Russia to return to compliance with the New START treaty. And they had the effects of denying Russia any benefits of its violation of the treaty. But the U.S. has no intention and would not in any way conduct any nuclear tests in violation of both our CTBT signatory obligations and our moratorium on nuclear testing. So the fact that Russia is walking away from the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty is another effort to destabilize, but it in no way will affect the U.S.'s lock-solid commitment not to conduct nuclear tests and to support the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty and strongly and forcefully work towards its entry into force, understanding the significant challenges that that treaty faces.
You began by saying the United States did take some measures. What were they? What did the response consist of?
Yeah, so I kind of combined two issues, so I should clarify. In response to Russia illegally suspending our last bilateral arms control treaty with it, the New START treaty, the United States took measures, again, to defy any benefit, to prevent any benefit to Russia from their violation of that treaty. So we cut off our notifications to Russia, including notifications about the change in status of treaty-accountable items such as missiles, launchers, and bombers. And we've only agreed to continue those measures that Russia itself has said it will abide by. Now, that means the central caps, in other words, the limits on strategic forces. Russia has said it will abide by that. Russia has also said it would continue to provide launch notifications, and we will do the same. But certainly, there is no world in which we can provide a benefit to Russia for its failure to comply with New START, and that they can sort of gather positive reaction to violating international law. So we're very much working to understand what we can do to bring Russia back into an arms control framework, realizing that nuclear risk reduction is in both of our interests, but open-ended competition in strategic nuclear forces and a continuing arms race is certainly in neither of our interests. And so we'll see what we can do to reestablish a limitation that can be adhered to by both sides.
Should rank-and-file Americans, just people who follow the news, be more worried about this speculation about nuclear weapons, the rendering of something that kept the genie in the bottle for 40 years by making the thinkable unthinkable, this idea that they were just beyond use because use was so horrific that you couldn't even really rationally discuss it as a weapon of war? Is the atmosphere when North Korea's actively testing, when Japan and South Korea are nervously looking at the Kim arsenal, when people go on and blithely talk about open-air testing again on Russian television, does it change the context, the atmosphere? Are nuclear weapons, in a way, back?
We very much hope not, but we're not just relying on hope. We're trying to find ways to manage nuclear risks. The Biden-Harris administration is taking a very clear-eyed approach to all of the nuclear risks and the strategic challenges that we're facing as a result of Russia's destabilizing behavior, as a result of the saber rattling that we see from Russia and potentially others. So we're working with our partners and allies to prevent additional irresponsible actions that, again, can result in escalatory cycles. We're working across the U.S. interagency and with our partners and allies, again, to develop mechanisms that can helpfully reduce the risk of misunderstanding and provide for future potential arms control measures with Russia should they recognize the challenges that nuclear risk poses for their own community and their own safety and security. But we're not sitting still. We're taking this opportunity to raise awareness of how we can reduce strategic risks, reduce risks from misunderstanding and miscalculation in the absence of Russia and in the absence of China or North Korea engaging in these conversations as well. We've started numerous processes, including in the United Nations First Committee that talks about about disarmament and international security to try to push forward risk reduction measures such as the prevention of anti-satellite tests that create debris, a resolution that talks about prohibiting radiological weapons, greater transparency and confidence building measures through collective efforts outside of the UN, but also within the resolution process of the UN. So we're trying to do our best to use all of the tools available to raise awareness of the threat and to try to prevent it from growing with respect to the irresponsible behavior of Russia in this illegal Ukrainian continuing invasion.
The Chinese set off their first bomb in the 1960s, but their arsenal was always perceived to be very small. But in recent years, obviously, China's become much more technologically able, much more militarily able, and its arsenal has grown. It's estimated by the Pentagon at 500 weapons now. When I think back to being a kid and a young reporter and looking at television reports on arms control talks and all that, it was always a Soviet-American thing, whether it was Brezhnev and Nixon or Reagan and his various Soviet counterparts. China just wasn't in the math. Do we have to look at the world in a different way? Do you have to look at the world in a different way because of where you sit at the Bureau, because of the way China changes the balance of terror?
I mean, I think as our National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, specifically said on June 2nd, we are ready to engage China without preconditions to ensure that competition is managed and that our competition does not veer into conflict. And I think we very much hope to work with Beijing directly on renewed efforts toward diplomacy and stabilizing our relationship and manage our inherent competitions. In our bureau, we're prepared very much to work with Beijing where our interests align and to keep those lines of communication open. And strategic risk reduction is one area where we see strong intersecting interests with China. So while we will continue to work with the interagency to maintain our abilities to defend and deter a range of threats to ourselves, our allies, and partners, we will also continue to encourage China to substantively engage on risk reduction, whether bilaterally with us directly or multilaterally through the P5, the permanent 5 members of the Security Council. And certainly avoiding misunderstanding and miscalculations and misperception is in our mutual interest. And I think China is very much realizing that we need to have communication capacity to avoid unnecessary missteps in a relationship that has grown significantly more tense in the challenging geopolitical environment and certainly has been destabilized by an inability to communicate directly about our ongoing competition.
After the dissolution of the Soviet Union, I know that one of the big concerns in Washington, and there was apparatus set up to try to help in this endeavor, was the worry about fissile material moving around the world, where it was, who had it, refined to what level, and so on. Does the United States feel that its partners, who share that interest in knowing where this stuff is, have been fully on board? Are there so many rogue actors in the world that it's hard to keep track of where this stuff is? Is this world a new world during the rise of the rest and so many more capable labs and scientists and physicists around the world, a place where you can keep track of where the stuff is?
Certainly, you raise a good point that this is a big challenge, but I think it means that we just need to more aggressively lean forward on trying to prevent the spread of fissile material, trying to understand what the possibilities for a controlled treaty are. And we certainly have been working very closely with allies and partners on trying to move forward to help manage what is a very challenging risk. And I think part of it is just raising awareness of how the spread of fissile material is in no one's interest, that non-state actors having access to it, even greater creation of it domestically for nuclear weapons poses a challenge and poses an indestructible and challenging to destroy problem that we then have to address down the road. So these are conversations that are very active and happening very broadly with partners and allies, but it's a hard push, especially when you have one of the P5 countries in the form of China that hasn't committed to not creating more fissile material for the purposes of their nuclear stockpile. And yet that is something that we would very much encourage them to do because of the challenges that fissile material poses to the world and to every country.
What's the value proposition? If you or your counterparts in the Department of Energy or the Department of Defense are trying to convince the representatives of a country that it's better to do this inside the multilateral structure. You want to have nuclear power plants. You want to develop a top drawer physics industry that handles these materials and studies them. Join us in this multilateral endeavor rather than going it alone. What's in it for them?
I think you can't underestimate the value of having a transparent and safe and secure and truly understood civil nuclear program that provides confidence as opposed to raises concerns when the absence of being part of the multilateral system is the route that countries take. I think having safeguards in place, having oversight, being able to talk about nuclear risk and prevention of diversion, all of these issues bring countries into the responsible player category that will then provide for greater cooperation on the benefits of civil nuclear risk and the value of being able to get this technology for the medicinal and health purposes are really provided to those countries that have programs that are safeguarded and that are overseen in the multilateral context. So the value proposition is truly be a part of the responsible players, allow international oversight and access in a way that provides confidence, and thus reap greater benefits to your civil nuclear program and be able to learn from and also share expertise in a way that provides for greater protection for these programs and civilian capacity to utilize in a safe way that's better for the communities involved.
Among the acknowledged nuclear powers, are there places that are more or less in compliance with international regimes, that are more or less transparent about what they do and how they do it? You mentioned China. Are there others?
Well, I mean, Russia is violating almost every single transparency and confidence building aspect of the international regimes that it's a party to, right? I think it's indicated a significant willingness to walk away from stabilizing international law principles. I mean, even in its very overt decision to violate the UN Charter by furthering its invasion of Ukraine. So we would encourage Russia to come back into the international legal architecture that Russia helped develop along with the United States and others. So it's something actually very much in the Russian interest to comply with. But we, across the board, encourage all countries to be as transparent and responsible as possible to prevent disinformation, to prevent misunderstanding and miscalculation.
What's the hottest item in your inbox? What's keeping you up at night?
Well, I think everyone is excited about potential responsible behaviors in emerging technologies. So, our political declaration on the responsible use of AI and autonomy in the military is something that we're very much pushing and receiving great support for, but also responsible behaviors in outer space. We're hoping to develop sort of a more responsible approach to the use of broader emerging technologies in the military arena, quantum technologies, and other sort of capacities that could expand or even destabilize. So, trying to get our head around how we define responsible behavior so that we can prevent destabilizing and irresponsible activities. So there's certainly a lot of stuff keeping me up at night, but I'm enthusiastic about our efforts to learn from other countries and to work with them to prevent some of these emerging technologies from worsening a challenging security environment.
Well, how could they potentially change what happens in war? I mean, you could go back to Agincourt or or the defense of Vienna against the Ottomans, and military technology and the way we fight war have always been, and the way we think about it and the way we try to regulate it have always been a little bit out of sync. Our sort of mores have to catch up with our weapons sometimes. What's the threat when it comes to autonomy on the battlefield, robot soldiers, AI? What do you worry about?
Yeah, absolutely. I would say that we have a challenge if we don't appreciate the risks that this new technology can bring into a system. So we certainly all appreciate that artificial intelligence can bring some benefits in the military space. It can speed up the capacity to combine relevant information. It can allow decision makers to have more information before decisions are made. But when we think about incorporating artificial intelligence into the actual decision-making process itself, allowing it to make decisions, then we have to be aware of the risks that it can incorporate. We have to be aware of the inherent human biases that can sometimes be brought into systems without our knowing. We have to be aware of the challenges that not understanding the contexts for the AI system's use could bring to operators if they're not appropriately trained, or they don't have the ability to question AI systems upon AI systems, adding greater inconsistency into something that already is a challenging sort of environment, a fog of war environment. So being able to talk with other countries about these risks, about the need for AI use to conform with international law, the need to appreciate how you need some auditability to your use of AI in the military arena. And we're not talking about lethal autonomous weapons specifically, though that is obviously an element of AI's use in the military arena. We're talking more broadly. So the use of AI in logistics, the use of AI in resource management, what we need people to understand and appreciate. We've heard this from numerous countries and have incorporated their concerns and comments in our political declaration, is that there is a risk every time you rely on artificial intelligence and autonomy to collate information and make decisions, that you're incorporating some errors that you cannot have previously anticipated into the process. And when you bring it into a military arena, it just becomes that much more concerning that you risk miscalculation, misunderstanding, and unintentional escalation, three things that we constantly are fighting against. And so raising awareness of these risks is something that I think everyone needs to sort of work into their military appreciation and work into their systems that have AI. And, speaking from the United States, understanding where AI is even operating in the first place, right? Because so many of us have come to rely on our phones and our computers and our capabilities without fully appreciating where the information is AI generated and where it is not. And so really trying to get back to the basics of what AI is doing for us and how it operates in our military context so that there is some oversight capacity and some auditability, I think will help reduce the risks that AI could naturally include.
Mallory Stewart is the Assistant Secretary for the Bureau of Arms Control, Verification, and Compliance at the State Department. Thanks for joining us on Shifting Ground.
Thank you so much for having me.
You've been listening to On Shifting Ground, produced in partnership with KQED, with funding from listeners like you. Today's episode was produced by Matteo Schimpf, Adam Ailey, and Andrew Stelzer. It was fact-checked by Sienna Barnes. It was mixed and mastered by Matteo Schimpf. Additional production and engineering were provided by Rob Spate. KQED's Jim Bennett is our technical supervisor. Jared Sport is our executive producer. Philip Yun is CEO of World Affairs. Our music is from Blue Dot Sessions. I'm Ray Suarez. Thanks for listening.